first heavy snow of the season had already swallowed Boston whole by the time Camille Whitlock decided she would rather freeze on a sidewalk than spend one more minute dreading the man she was supposed to meet. And she had no way of knowing that the stranger who would thaw her hands in the next quarter hour was the exact man she was dreading. She was 41 years old and ran Whitlock Caldwell, an asset management firm that controlled more money than 3 of the states she could see from her office window, and yet on that particular Friday night, she felt about as steady as the wet flakes coming sideways down Charles Street. 6 hours earlier, she had sat across a conference table and quietly dismantled a competitor who had spent 2 years trying to swallow her firm. She had watched the man's face go gray as the final terms were read aloud, watched him gather his papers with shaking hands, and she had felt nothing. That was the part that frightened her lately. Not the fighting, the nothing that came after. Her friend Priya, who was also her chief operating officer and the only person on earth allowed to scold her, had cornered her that afternoon with a reservation card and a tone that brooked no argument. "You are going to have dinner with a human being who has never read your balance sheet," Priya had said. "He fixes old things for a living. He has a kid, he has no idea who you are, and that is the entire point. One dinner, Camille. Consider it medicine." Camille had agreed only to make her stop. Then, in a small act of rebellion against the security detail and the town car and the whole armored apparatus of her life, she had sent her driver home, told him she wanted to walk the last few blocks and clear her head, and stepped out into a storm that turned out to be far meaner than the forecast promised. The walk was a mistake from the first step. Her heels found ice under the powder. The wind off the river cut through her coat as though the wool were tissue. And somewhere near the bottom of a hill, her foot went out from under her, and she came down hard on one knee. And the thing she had been clutching in her gloved hand for courage all evening flew loose and skittered across the frozen brick. It was a watch, not one of the dozen expensive pieces in her safe. This one was small and old and worn smooth, a lady's wristwatch with a cracked enamel face and a band so soft from age it felt like ribbon. It had belonged to her grandmother Rosalind, who had raised Camille after her parents proved more interested in their own ambitions than in their daughter, and who had pressed the watch into her hand on her deathbed and said, "Time is the only thing you can't buy back, sweetheart, so be careful who you spend it on." Camille wore it the way other people carried a saint's medal, and now it lay face down on the ice, and when she crawled to it and turned it over, the crystal was spider-webbed and the second hand had stopped dead. She knelt there in the snow, a woman who had not cried in front of another living soul since she was 9 years old, and felt her throat close. The only light on the whole dark block came from a narrow shop front halfway down, a warm amber glow leaking out around a frosted window. She got up, pride be damned, and walked toward it because it was that, or weep on a sidewalk. The sign over the door read, "Marsh Slock Works," in gold letters that had been touched up by hand more than once. A bell jingled when she pushed inside, and the warmth hit her like a wall, and so did the sound. The whole shop was alive with ticking. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls and crowded the shelves. Grandfather cases and mantel clocks and ship's chronometers and tiny carriage clocks under glass domes, every one of them keeping its own patient time. And the combined whisper of all those movements was the most peaceful thing she had heard in years. A man looked up from a workbench at the back, a loop pushed up onto his forehead, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. "We're closed, I'm afraid," he said, not unkindly. "I was just—" Then he saw her face and the snow melting in her hair and the way she was cradling her hand against her chest. He came around the counter at once. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." It came out automatically, the same lie she told everyone. "I slipped, it's nothing." He was tall, with the kind of forearms a man earns rather than buys, and a tiredness around the eyes that she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror. But his hands, when he reached toward her, were careful. "You're shaking," he said. "Sit, please. There's a heater right here." He guided her to a stool by an old cast-iron radiator and went to the back, and came out with a mug of coffee that he pressed into her good hand. "It's not fancy, it's a few hours old and probably terrible, but it's hot." She wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth seep back into her fingers, and only then did she notice she was still clutching the broken watch. "May I?" he asked, nodding at it. She hesitated. She did not hand that watch to anyone. But there was something in the quiet of the shop and the patience in his face, and she opened her palm. He took it the way a surgeon takes an instrument, pulled the loop down over one eye, turned it gently to the light, and his whole expression changed. "This is a Swiss lever movement," he murmured more to himself than to her. 18 joules, Hand finished. Somebody made this for somebody they loved. He looked up. Where did you get it? It was my grandmother's. It's beautiful, and it's not dead before you start grieving it. The crystal's cracked, which looks dramatic, but the second hand's just hung up on a sliver of glass that worked its way under the dial. 5 minutes with the right tools. He paused. If you'll trust me with it. She did not trust people, that was practically her job, but she found herself nodding. He cleared a space, set out a felt mat and a row of impossibly small tools, and bent to the work, and she watched. He had the same total absorption she felt in a negotiation, except there was no opponent here, nothing to defeat, only a small broken thing to be made whole. He spoke a little while he worked, the way some people whistle. My daughter would love this watch, he said. Junie, she's 7. She's got a shoebox under her bed, full of dead watches she rescues from yard sales. She thinks every broken thing has a second life in it if you're patient enough. He smiled without looking up. Gets that from her great-grandfather, not from me. He started this shop. I just kept the lights on, barely. Where's her mother? Camille asked, and immediately regretted the bluntness. But he didn't flinch. Gone. 3 years now. She wanted a different kind of life than a man who smells like clock oil could give her. Can't really blame her. He tweezed a flake of crystal free, set it aside. I'd been working overseas before all that. Geneva, mostly. Restoration for an auction house. The kind of pieces that go for the price of a house. Good money. Then my grandfather got sick, and Junie was on the way, and I came home to take over the shop, and the marriage didn't survive the homecoming. He shrugged, a small, honest motion. So now I fix church clocks and estate sale heirlooms in the North End, and try not to think about the bank. The casual way he said it told her it was anything but casual. She knew that voice. She used it herself when the stakes were highest. The bank, she repeated. End of the month. He said it lightly, and it landed like a stone. 100-year-old building, 100-year-old debt, and a landlord who'd love nothing more than to turn this into a place that sells $40 candles. But he held up the watch, and the second hand was sweeping again, smooth and certain, ticking off the seconds as though it had never stopped. Some things are worth keeping running. Try not to drop her again. Camille took the watch back and felt her eyes sting for the second time in an hour, and she hated it, and she was grateful for it in equal measure. What do I owe you? She asked, reaching for her purse, because money was the language she knew how to speak, the wall she put between herself and feeling indebted to anyone. He waved it off. You don't owe me anything. You looked like you'd had a worse night than me, and that's saying something. Then he glanced at the clock over the door, one of his own, and grimaced. Speaking of bad nights, I'm late for the worst evening of my life. That makes 2 of us, she said before she could stop herself. He laughed, surprised. What's yours? A blind date. She rolled her eyes. My friend's idea. Some single father who fixes old things, apparently, who's going to spend 2 hours being either intimidated by me or after my money or both. She heard the words leave her mouth and felt a strange flush of shame she couldn't account for. I don't even know why I agreed. Something crossed his face, quick, and was gone. Huh, he said. Mine's a finance woman, a CEO. My sister set it up. Swears she's brilliant and lonely, but I figure she'll take one look at the clock oil under my nails and order the check. He shrugged into a wool coat that had seen better decades. We're both going to the same little corner of misery, sounds like. L'Auberge? Camille's heart did something complicated. Newbury Street. 2 blocks that way. He grabbed his keys, flipped the sign in the window, and held the door. Walk with me? The sidewalks are murder out there, and I'd hate to fix your watch only to have you break your neck. So they walked, the 2 of them, into the snow, side by side, neither one of them knowing. He talked the whole way, easy and warm, about Junie and her shoebox of watches, about a grandfather clock he was restoring for a church in Charlestown, that had stopped on the exact minute its founding pastor died a century before, and Camille, who spent her days surrounded by people angling for something, realized, with a small shock, that this man wanted nothing from her at all. He had no idea she was worth more than the whole street they were walking on. He just liked talking, and she found to her own astonishment that she liked listening. By the time the gold awning of L'Auberge appeared through the snow, she did not want the walk to end. Well, he said, stopping under it, snow in his hair, this is me, and I go to be judged by a spreadsheet in a dress. He stuck out his hand. It was nice meeting you, whoever you are. Take care of that watch. She shook his hand. His grip was warm and rough and steady. Theo, he added. Theo Marsh. And there it was, hanging in the cold air between them, and Camille felt the bottom drop out of the evening, because her friend Priya had texted her the name that afternoon along with the reservation, and the name had been Theo Marsh. She opened her mouth, closed it. He was already pulling open the heavy door, already stepping into the warm gold light of the restaurant, and she followed a few paces behind, her grandmother's watch ticking against her wrist, her whole carefully armored heart suddenly wide open and undefended. Inside, L'Auberge was everything she'd expected and dreaded. Crystal and white linen and a string trio in the corner playing something tasteful and bloodless. The kind of room where the food cost more than dignity and everyone pretended not to be watching everyone else. The maître d'hôtel took one look at Theo's worn coat and snow-damp shoes and arranged his face into a mask of professional contempt, and Camille watched the man's posture change. "I have a reservation," Theo said, a little stiff. "Marsh. Meeting he glanced around. "I'm meeting someone." "Of course," the maître d'hôtel said in the tone of a man humoring a child. "And the lady's name?" "Whitlock," Camille said, stepping up beside Theo. The maître d'hôtel's entire body recalibrated. "Men's Whitlock," he breathed, suddenly bowing. "We had no idea, of course, your usual section, please." And Camille watched Theo Marsh turn and look at her, really look at her, and watched the understanding land. "You," he said quietly. "Me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the maître d'hôtel hovered, baffled, holding two leather menus like a man at a tennis match. Then Theo started to laugh. It began low in his chest and built, helpless and bright, until he had to brace a hand on the back of a chair. "You're the terrifying CEO," he managed. "You're the finance woman who's going to be after my money." "And you," Camille said, and to her own amazement she was laughing too. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't laughed since before her grandmother died. "You're the single father who's going to be intimidated by me. I fixed your opinion of me on the sidewalk and you didn't even know it." "You fixed nothing," he said, eyes shining. "I fixed your watch. I want that on the record." They were seated, finally, at a banquet by the window with the snow coming down beyond the glass, and the spell of the sidewalk simply carried on, as though it had never been interrupted. Stripped of all the dread, with the worst already behind them, they talked the way she had not talked to anyone in years. He told her about coming home from Geneva to a dying grandfather and a marriage already cracking, about learning to braid a toddler's hair from a video at 2 in the morning, about the particular fear of a father who knows the rent is due and the work is slow. She told him things she had never told a board, a therapist, a lover, about Rosalind, about being raised by a grandmother because her own parents were too busy building empires to build a family, about how she had built her own empire anyway and woken up one day inside it like a person inside a beautifully appointed tomb. When the sommelier arrived with a wine list the size of a hymnal, Camille saw Theo's eyes flick down a menu, saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly at the prices, saw him reach for his wallet under the table to count what was inside it. She had spent 20 years reading exactly that flicker across the faces of men who could not match her, and she had used it against them. She did not use it now. "We won't be dining tonight," she told the sommelier smoothly, in the voice she used to end meetings. "Mr. Marsh and I have somewhere to be. Just bring a glass of the house red, something honest, and put it on my account." "Camille," Theo started. "I hate this restaurant," she said low, leaning in. "The food is small and the people are smaller, and I only chose it because it was public and neutral, and I wanted an easy exit. I have wanted to leave since I walked in. Let me leave with you instead." And that was when a shadow fell across the table. Camille Whitlock, slumming, are we? She knew the voice before she looked up, and her spine went to steel. Grayson Holt stood over them in a suit that cost more than most cars, silver at the temples, a smile on his face that never reached his eyes. He sat on 2 boards she answered to, had spent the last year quietly trying to undermine her, and had lost a great deal of money that very afternoon when her acquisition went through. He was the kind of man who collected things to be admired and people to be used. His gaze slid over Theo's worn coat with theatrical pity. "And who is this? Don't tell me Whitlock Caldwell has opened a charity wing." He chuckled at his own joke. "You'll have to forgive my surprise. I didn't realize you'd started bringing the help to dinner." Camille's hand closed around her water glass hard enough to ache. "Grayson, leave, now, before I—" "It's all right," Theo said. He didn't shrink. He didn't bristle. He simply leaned back, relaxed, and looked up at Grayson Holt with the mild, assessing patience of a man who had spent his life taking the measure of fine mechanisms and finding most of them wanting. His eyes settled on the watch at Holt's wrist, a fat gold piece that the man had angled deliberately toward the light. "That's a nice watch," Theo said pleasantly. Holt smirked and turned his wrist, glad to be noticed. "Wartime perpetual calendar, one of 40 made. Cost me more than your shop, I'd wager." "Probably," Theo agreed. "It's a shame about the dial, though." The smirk flickered. "There's nothing wrong with the dial. The loom on the numerals is the wrong shade of cream for that reference, and the font on the date wheel is a service replacement from at least 40 years after the case was made." Theo's voice never rose. It stayed warm, almost gentle, which made it so much worse. Somebody married a real case to a redialed movement and a fantasy provenance and sold it to a man who wanted a story more than he wanted a watch. The seconds are running about 2 minutes slow over the night too, which means the mainspring's tired and it hasn't been serviced in years. You don't own a rare watch, Mr. Holt. You own an expensive misunderstanding that's never been wound by someone who cares. It happens a lot with men who buy a thing to be seen wearing it instead of to keep it running. The silence at the table was total. Two of Holt's associates, hovering a few feet back, suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Holt's face went a deep, blotchy red. He yanked his sleeve down over the watch. "You don't know what year." "I spent 10 years in Geneva authenticating pieces for an auction house," Theo said, almost apologetic. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. Have a good evening." He turned back to Camille as though Holt had already ceased to exist. "You said something about leaving?" Grayson Holt opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and walked away stiff-backed and humiliated, his associates trailing behind him like a man's regrets. Camille stared at Theo Marsh across the white linen and felt something in her chest that she had spent 2 decades refusing to feel. "I have watched men twice your size try to do that to him for years and fail," she said. "You did it in 30 seconds with a watch." "I told you," he said, standing, holding out his hand. "Some things just need somebody who knows what they're looking at. Now please get me out of here before I have to look at another $40 amuse-bouche." She took his hand and let him pull her up, and they left the gold light and the small people behind them and walked back out into the clean falling snow, and she had never felt so unburdened in her life. He took her to a diner. Doyle's, an all-night place under the highway with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee machine that had been burning the same pot since the Carter administration, where a cook named Sal called Theo by name and didn't blink at the woman in the $1,000 coat sliding into the booth across from him. They ordered cheeseburgers and a mountain of fries, and Camille Whitlock, who had eaten in 3-star restaurants on 4 continents, picked up the greasy burger in both hands, took an enormous bite, and closed her eyes. "Oh," she said around it. "Oh, that's obscene, l'auberge wishes." Theo laughed so hard he had to set down his coffee. They stayed until the windows fogged and the snow piled up against the glass. She learned that he hummed off-key when he was happy, and that he carried a photograph of his daughter in his wallet behind a receipt, a gap-toothed girl holding up a clock she'd repaired herself. He learned that the most powerful woman he'd ever met was secretly terrified that she had spent her whole life buying things and would die without ever having truly kept any of them. At some point, her hand found its way across the cracked formica and rested on top of his, oil stains and all, and he turned his palm up and held it, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying. He drove her home in a truck held together by faith and duct tape to a gate on a hill overlooking the harbor, and she stood in the falling snow on her own driveway and did not want to go inside. "Thank you," she said, "for my watch, for Grayson, for the worst best night I've had in years." "Anytime," he said. "You know where the shop is." "I do," she said. "I really do." And then, for 3 days, nothing. Theo told himself it was for the best. He stood in the cold front room of Marsh Clockworks the following Monday with the bank's final notice in his hand and the foreclosure date circled in red, and he listened to 100 clocks tick down the time he had left. And he told himself that women like Camille Whitlock did not end up with men who smelled of clock oil and owed the bank more money than they'd see in 3 good years. Junie sat cross-legged on the floor by the radiator, tongue between her teeth, carefully cleaning the tiny gears of a dead pocket watch with a paintbrush meant for model airplanes, humming to herself, oblivious to the fact that the shop she was sitting in might belong to someone else by Saturday. "Daddy," she said, holding up the watch, "if I fix all the little pieces, it'll work again, right? Even though it looks broken?" "That's the idea, Junebug," he said, and his voice cracked on it. He was still standing there when he heard it. An engine in the alley, the bell over the door, a gust of cold air. He turned, and Camille Whitlock walked into his shop. She was not wearing a designer dress or CEO's armor. She was in jeans and a plain sweater and a winter coat, her hair loose, snowflakes melting on her shoulders, and she looked younger and softer and somehow more powerful than she had in all that crystal L'Auberge. Her grandmother's watch was on her wrist. She spotted Junie first, and her whole face changed, the careful executive mask dissolving into something open and warm. She crouched down to the little girl's level. "That's a beautiful watch you're fixing," she said. "Is that a cylinder escapement?" Junie's eyes went huge. "You know what an escapement is?" "A friend of mine taught me, very recently," Camille said, and glanced up at Theo, and the look in her eyes nearly took his knees out. "He's the best in the city, maybe the best anywhere." "That's my dad," Junie said proudly. "I know." Camille stood and walked to the workbench and set down a thick folder right next to the bank's red-stamped notice. She had clearly seen the notice. She did not pretend otherwise. "Camille," Theo said carefully, "what is this?" "This," she said, tapping the folder, "is a business proposal, and before your pride says a single word, you're going to let me finish, because I am very good at this part." She opened it. "Last month, my firm closed on the old Sterling Exchange building downtown. It's a landmark. It's also 140 years old and full of antique clocks, a tower movement, a lobby regulator, dozens of historic timepieces in the original boardrooms that have been neglected for decades by a maintenance company that bills me a fortune and can't tell a pendulum from a paperweight. On top of that, my late grandmother left behind a collection of pieces I've never had properly restored because I've never trusted anyone to touch them." She slid a single page across to him. "That is a 3-year exclusive contract to restore, authenticate, and maintain all of it. It comes with a retainer paid in full, up front. It is, I'm told, more than enough to make a certain conversation with a certain bank disappear entirely." Theo stared at the page. The number at the bottom blurred. "Camille, I can't take a—" "It is not a handout." Her voice went flat and final, the boardroom voice, but her eyes were anything but. "I do not make sentimental investments, Mr. Marsh. I have built a fortune on knowing the difference between value and price. And 3 nights ago, I watched a man read a watch like a book, and humble the most arrogant person I know without raising his voice. I have spent 20 years paying premium rates for mediocrity. I am done. I want the best. You are the best. This is the single most rational acquisition I have made all year." She paused, and the armor slipped, and underneath it was just a woman standing in a clock shop in the snow. "And also," she said more quietly, "I needed an excuse to see you again, because I knew you'd never accept an invitation back to L'Auberge." Theo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the contract, and at the red stamp notice next to it, and at his daughter on the floor patiently bringing a dead thing back to life, and something in his chest that had been wound too tight for 3 years. Finally, let go. "You'd really trust me with your grandmother's collection?" he asked. "I trusted you with her watch on the worst night of my year," Camille said, "and you gave it back to me running." He reached out and took her hand, the way he'd taken it across the diner table, and her clean fingers folded around his stained ones without the slightest hesitation. "There's a place around the corner," he said. "Terrible coffee, cracked booths, a cook who'll embarrass me in front of you." "Doyle's," she said, and smiled, and it was the smile from the diner, the real one. "I know it. I'm buying." "You always say that." "I always mean it." From the floor, Junie looked up at the two of them holding hands over a contract and a foreclosure notice, in a room full of clocks all ticking together, and announced, with the total certainty of a 7-year-old, "I told you, if you fix all the little pieces, it works again, even when it looks broken." Theo Marsh pulled Camille Whitlock toward him in the warm amber light of the shop his grandfather built, and as he kissed her, surrounded by 100 patient movements, measuring out a future that had suddenly cracked wide open with possibility, he understood the thing his grandfather had tried to teach him his whole life. The most precious things in the world are almost never the ones that arrive perfect and gleaming behind glass. They are the ones found stopped and forgotten in the cold, taken in, understood, and wound carefully back to life by someone willing to give them their time. I keep coming back to the moment Theo Marsh waived off payment for a watch he had every reason to charge for, because I think that one small gesture decided everything that came after. Here was a man drowning in debt, 2 weeks from losing the shop his grandfather built, and his first instinct when a freezing stranger walked through his door was to hand her his last cup of coffee and ask if she was hurt. That kind of decency doesn't come from having money to spare. It comes from deciding long before anyone is watching what kind of person you'll be when no one would blame you for being smaller. Camille had spent 20 years in rooms full of people who would have charged her double and called it a favor. Theo charged her nothing, and that's the exact reason she couldn't stop thinking about him. But being good-hearted alone would never have saved him. What turned Theo from a kind man into an unforgettable one was that he'd spent years quietly becoming the best at something. 10 winters in Geneva, 1,000 broken movements, a grandfather's patience passed hand to hand, all of it sitting in his fingers when he needed it most. When Grayson Holt tried to humiliate him at that table, Theo didn't get loud. He got precise. He read that man's wash like a confession because he'd done the work, year after thankless year, that let him see what other people only pretended to understand. That kind of knowing can't be bought at a place like L'Auberge. It's earned in an empty shop at midnight when nobody is clapping. And here's the part I never want to forget. Theo could have quit 100 times. He could have taken the easy corporate job, sold the building, let the candle store win. Instead, he kept the lights on through the divorce, through the loneliness, through every red stamp notice, because he believed some things are worth fixing even when the smart money says walk away. His daughter Junie said it better than I ever could. Sitting cross-legged on that shop floor with a paintbrush and a dead pocket watch, if you fix all the little pieces, it works again, even when it looks broken. She learned that from watching her father refuse to give up on broken things, including, I suspect, himself. So if that snowy night taught me anything, it's that the life you actually want rarely shows up gift-wrapped behind glass. It shows up stranded in the cold, asking to be helped. And the people who get to keep it are the ones who stayed honest when honesty cost them, who kept getting better at their craft when no one was watching, and who held on through the hard winters when letting go would have been so much easier. Fix the little pieces. It works again.